Hi, this is Arinfu, also known as Babe Arinfu. Today I'm going to talk about some of the most helpful things that I've learned when it comes to scene representation. Now, these ideas I'm only going to lightly brush over. I'm barely going to scrape the surface of these ideas, but I'm going to express the ideas as quickly as I can nonetheless. Okay, so what we have here is this random image that I found on Google. I think it was on some sort of blog site originally, something like that. And let me first say it's a beautiful image. It lines up with the rule of thirds. You have the rock in the first left third, and you have the horizon on the top third. It's really beautiful photo. Also, another thing I want to say about this photo is it's very large. It's like 3,000 pixels wide, and I love images that are this big. I'm obsessed with the details. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about has to do with composition and focus and how to represent your focus when you're creating an image. And so this first image that we're going to look at has to do with contrast focus. If you look at the rock in the foreground, like, first of all, this is a very perverted way to represent it, but it kind of gets the idea out anyway. You can see the background, and the things that I don't want to have be in focus are, I've got a lot more contrast to them. They've got more grays. The lightest spots are gray, the darkest spots are still gray. But on the thing that I want to have focus on, the lightest spots are white and the darkest spots are black. So you have the brightest whites and the blackest blacks in the part that you want to have the most contrast as the focus. The next way to represent focus is with color. You have everything else be black and white. You have the saturation taken way out of it, and then the part that you want to have focused is very saturated, or at least a little bit saturated. And the last concept I'm going to show you has to do with blur / softness / sharpness. You have the thing that you want to be in focus be the sharpest spot on the image, and everything else kind of be a lot more fuzzy or a lot more blurry. It doesn't have to be a forced blur, it more has to do with a focused sharpness. Remember, these three concepts are just something to keep in mind. A lot of photographers or artists use these concepts in reverse because they understand them to create a beautiful scene nonetheless. The point is that you understand these ideas so that when you're creating an image, you're paying close attention to the details and how you represent the image. Alright, so the next concept has to do with shape language and what shapes are attractive, which has a lot to do with the composition as well. Here you see I drew red lines on the image trying to understand the shape language of everything. So the actual rock form that you see is actually very complex. It's got a lot of round shapes coming out of it. And so I took the overall shape and angle of the shape as a whole and simplified it as these red lines and shapes, just to kind of get the idea. So then I would apply this to the image to, in theory, make the image better because the shapes are more attractive to look at. And if you look at the way the rocks are now, the rocks flow with the image kind of in a rotation sense. The hills flow a little bit better. Just everything's more simple and easier to look at. Alright, so this next concept has a lot more to do with depth, and you can see that this overpaint that I did looks really crappy. If you can overlook that and bear with me for a little while, I will explain to you fog depth or atmosphere depth. I'm not sure how to call it, but basically things turn into the sky color as they go further away from the screen. So if you look on the top left, I have a circle that says that this is the atmosphere color. That's not actually perfectly correct. The atmosphere color is more like a darkish blue, but it's okay because this is close enough. Okay, so here you can see I actually applied the fog depth so that the objects that are closer in the foreground have less of this color, and as the objects go into the background, they have more of this color, which kind of fades them away. The atmosphere takes them over because there's more atmosphere from here to there. So this expresses that idea, but it still looks super crappy, so I figured I would elaborate on why, and the biggest reason is because these objects look flat. Even though they have a lot of detail to speak for, they still look flat, which is why at the bottom of the screen I have the green letters saying flat. These two circles represent flatness and shape depth, which is basically just a small little shadow to give the thing more shape. So you can see on each of the mountains I added a dark spot and a light spot. So obviously the light spot is the spot that's facing the camera more, and the dark spot is where it curves around. Also on the nearest foreground, I made it from light to dark, just added a gradient on there. And that makes my whole scene feel like it has depth and it's going into the picture, even though the paint over is really crappy and really retarded. Also, the last thing I felt was important to address on this scene is that it's not properly being adapted to the rule of thirds. So I moved the scene over and applied it to a rule of thirds a lot better, and now the scene's a lot more attractive. If I were to continue overpainting on this scene to create a real nice background, then the things that I would do is play with the shape language a little bit more to make it more of attractive shapes, and then just to kind of paint in the details, really. So last thing I want to talk about is mood lighting and representation of a scene color-wise. This scene is very cloudy, so the sun is kind of covered by the clouds, giving everything on the ground kind of an ambient, even lighting. And this scene is very ideal for photo editing because it means that all the objects are well represented, but it doesn't have a major lighting, so it makes it just really easy to work with and mess around with. Okay, so the first thing I do here is I make the sky a lot more blue, because before it was just like this depressing kind of a gray, which is great because it represented a foggy Viking scene, and that's just brilliant. So the next thing I did was make a very sloppy selection. Selected where I thought the shadows and the highlights would be, and then just brightened everything up. So now you kind of have a sunlit scene. It's colorful, bright, and nice to look at. The next thing I did here is kind of a little bit crappy, and the reason for that is it's not a perfect ambient scene, makes it a little bit harder to work with, but it's decently close to a perfect ambient scene. It's pretty ambient. The main thing that I did to make it look darker is making the background color just black. I've actually got a bit of blue on there to give it a little bit more of a interesting look to it. Yeah, I took the brightness down on it a little bit. I also took the saturation way out, but I also made the atmosphere color on the objects going into the background match the new background color, because the background color changed. This next scene, I tried to increase the amount of depth fog that was in there, and it isn't perfectly done. I should have kind of silhouetted some of the objects in a little bit of a background in order to show that rock up a little bit more, add some fog to that. But this kind of shows you can make a scene also look rainy if you add more of that fog depth, atmosphere color coming forward, add some kind of like foggy shapes with a texture brush, maybe, whatever. And also, the last thing that I did to this was I added bleeding to it. I duplicated the image, blurred it, and then turned the opacity on the blurred one down quite a bit, so you still had that little bit of a bleeding color effect to it, but it doesn't change the sharpness as a whole. It only changes the sharpness from a distance and gives everything kind of like this bloom feel. It's warm summer reds and yellows and more saturation. The more saturation you have, the warmer a scene can feel, regardless of the colors in some cases. Usually the warmest colors are reds and yellows. If you add blues and things like that to it, it can make it feel a lot more cold. And then this final image was kind of to show the cold winter blues and greens and less saturation overall. So I feel like one of the most effective ways to make this feel colder is actually to take the saturation out of it, because if they were bright blues, it wouldn't express the coldness as much as if it had like less saturated blues. I mean, and I know this image isn't perfect, it's kind of cropped very crappy, but that's kind of it. The major thing that I didn't really get to talk much about is shape language and simplifying shapes. So hopefully this was informative. So let me know in the comment section if you think that there's anything that I missed, or better yet, if you think that any of the ideas that I represented were misrepresented and that I need to be corrected on, because I want to hear these things. Also, if you liked this video, give the video a like, it really helps me out. If you really liked this video and want to reference it later, put it in your favorites. And finally, if you want more videos like this, then push the subscribe button.